There's a moment in history when the world doesn't shift because of violence. It shifts because someone rewrites the rules. March 1956. Harlem, New York. A man walks into the most exclusive nightclub in the city and openly defies the most powerful organization in America. He doesn't draw a weapon. He doesn't raise his voice. He simply makes a choice that forces an entire system to reorganize itself around him. This is not a story about what happened that night. This is a story about how a man with nothing became powerful enough to change the rules for everyone. To understand Bumpy Johnson, you first need to understand the invisible wall he would eventually break. It's 1945. New York City is the center of the criminal underworld. But it's not chaotic. It's structured. Organized. Like a government. Like an empire. The 5 Italian families, Gambino, Genovese, Luciano, Colombo, Bonanno, they control everything that matters. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Manhattan. They have territories. They have rules. They have a hierarchy so rigid that stepping out of line doesn't just get you killed. It gets your entire family killed. At the top sits Lucky Luciano himself, exiled in Italy but still running the organization like a chess master moving pieces across a board he can barely see. Below him are the bosses, the underbosses, the captains. Each with their own territory, their own soldiers, their own profit streams. Gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, narcotics, extortion. The system is brutal, but it's predictable. Everyone knows their place. Everyone understands the cost of ambition. But Harlem is different. Harlem is black. And the Italian mob has never understood Black America the way they understand their own streets. They tried to control it. Of course they did. They sent soldiers. They sent enforcers. They sent men with guns and reputations and the confidence of knowing that they'd never met anyone who wouldn't back down. And every time, something unexpected happened. The men never came back the same way they left. By the late 1940s, a man named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson is building something impossible. He's not Italian. That's strike one. He's not connected to any of the 5 families. That's strike two. He's intelligent, disciplined, and he understands something about Harlem that the Italian mob never will. He understands the people. Bumpy Johnson wasn't born into organized crime. He was born into poverty. Raised in South Carolina by a mother who worked 3 jobs and a father who taught him that dignity matters more than money. He learned early that the world wasn't designed for men like him. That the system was rigged. That respect had to be taken because it would never be given. By the time he was 30, Bumpy had already spent years in prison. Learned the hardest lessons in the harshest classrooms. But he emerged different than the men around him. While they emerged angrier, more violent, more willing to use brutality, Bumpy emerged smarter. More calculating. More aware that violence was the tool of men who had no other options. He began small. Running numbers in Harlem. A betting game. The poor people's lottery. You pick 3 numbers. You put down $1. If your numbers hit, you win. It's illegal, but it's how people dream in neighborhoods where the banks won't lend and the system won't help. The numbers game had always been controlled by outsiders. Italian mob soldiers would come into Harlem, take the profits, take the respect, and disappear back to their territories. The money flowed out. Nothing flowed back in. Bumpy changed that. But here's what nobody expected: when the money stayed in Harlem, Harlem changed. You need to understand economics to understand how Bumpy Johnson rewrote the rules. Power isn't abstract. Power is concrete. It's money. It's information. It's relationships. It's the ability to solve problems that other people can't solve. The Italian mob had soldiers. Bumpy had something different. Bumpy had the people. When a family in Harlem couldn't make rent, Bumpy paid it. Not publicly. Not for glory. Quietly. Systematically. Building invisible networks of loyalty that ran deeper than any contract. When the police harassed black-owned businesses, Bumpy made calls. Not because he had authority over the police, but because he understood how the system actually worked. Politicians needed votes. Votes came from neighborhoods. Neighborhoods were loyal to men who protected them. When young men had no jobs and no hope, Bumpy gave them both. Work, money, respect, and a place in an organization that actually valued them. This wasn't charity. This was genius. He was building leverage that the Italian mob couldn't touch because they didn't understand it. They thought power came from intimidation. They didn't realize that Bumpy was building something more durable. He was building a system where people chose to be loyal because being loyal meant safety, prosperity, and dignity. The numbers operation became more than just money. It became a form of economic power. In a city where black banks didn't exist, where investment opportunities were closed to black people, the numbers game became the way wealth circulated through Harlem. Bumpy controlled the circulation. By 1950, Bumpy Johnson had created something that didn't exist before, an independent black criminal enterprise that rivaled the Italian mob's infrastructure. This was intolerable. In March 1950, the 5 Italian families made their first organized move against Bumpy Johnson. They didn't come with soldiers. They came with a proposal. A sit-down. Respectful. Professional. The kind of meeting that happens between equals. The message was simple: surrender control of Harlem. Accept a reduced territory. Take 20% of profits while the Italian mob takes 80%. Or face consequences. Bumpy listened. Calmly. Respectfully. Then he said no. The room went silent. In the world of organized crime, saying no to the Italian mob was a death sentence. Everyone in that room expected Bumpy to reconsider. To realize he was in the presence of power that couldn't be challenged. Instead, Bumpy stood up and walked out. For the first time in anyone's memory, a black man had said no to the Italian mob and left the room alive. The families conferenced. Vito Genovese, running his empire from Naples, Italy, called his brother Michael on a secure line. He refused. Vito's voice was tight. He walked out. Didn't even debate it. Then we used the next pressure point. And so they tried force. 8 soldiers came to Harlem. They were supposed to hit one of Bumpy's numbers operations in East Harlem, shake it down, take the money, send a message. They never made it back the same way they left. The operation was protected by men who understood that Bumpy was the only reason they had anything. Men who understood that every dollar they protected was a dollar that stayed in their community. Men who understood that losing to the Italian mob meant losing Harlem. The message came back to the 5 families clear: you can come to Harlem, but you won't come home the same way you left. Something changed after that. It wasn't dramatic. There were no headlines. The newspapers didn't understand what was happening. But throughout New York's criminal underworld, people understood. Bumpy Johnson wasn't going away. You couldn't intimidate him. You couldn't buy him. You couldn't force him out. The only option was negotiation. By 1953, there was an unspoken treaty. Harlem was Bumpy's territory. The Italian mob wouldn't touch it. In exchange, Bumpy wouldn't expand beyond Harlem. He wouldn't challenge the family's control of other neighborhoods. An invisible wall was drawn. Not on a map. Not in writing. But understood by everyone who mattered. Bumpy Johnson was now a power broker. A man the Italian mob had to talk to. A man whose territory they respected. A man who had forced them to rewrite rules that they'd written themselves. This was unprecedented. But there's a cost to rewriting rules. There's always a cost. The Italian mob accepted Harlem as Bumpy's territory, but they also decided to test him. To see if he could actually maintain control. To see if his authority was real or just bluff. The first test came quietly. A younger Italian captain decided to push the boundaries. Send a crew into parts of East Harlem. Try to skim some of Bumpy's numbers operation. Small moves. Deniable moves. The response was swift. Not violent in the way that makes headlines. But unmistakable in its message. The crew disappeared. Not killed, that would have started a war. Disappeared. Tied up, beaten badly enough that they'd remember the lesson forever, and deposited on the Italian side of the territorial line with a message, "Don't come back." The captain who sent them got a different message. His car exploded. Not with him in it, but while he was watching. A warning so precise that it proved something important: Bumpy could hurt you whenever he wanted. The explosion was just the opening move. The real threat was that he chose not to fully escalate. That kind of restraint is more terrifying than rage. Because restraint implies control. And control implies that the person causing the damage is thinking 3 moves ahead. By 1955, the rules have been rewritten. Bumpy Johnson is no longer a criminal operating in the margins of the mob's empire. He's a principal. A man who sits at tables with the family's representatives. A man who negotiates directly with captains and underbosses. The Italian mob learned a lesson that would echo through organized crime for decades: real power doesn't come from being the strongest. It comes from understanding the system better than everyone else. Bumpy understood something that most gangsters never figure out. He understood that a community was an asset. A resource. If you treat that community well, if you protect them, if you create prosperity within the territory, that community becomes your security. Your information network. Your loyalty. Your power. The Italian mob treated territories like occupied zones. Extract profit, maintain control through fear, move on. Bumpy treated Harlem like a kingdom. Build prosperity. Maintain control through respect. Create an alliance with the people. Different philosophies. Completely different results. By 1956, Bumpy controlled more territory than any black man had ever controlled in American organized crime. But more important than territory, he controlled legitimacy. In the eyes of Harlem residents, in the eyes of the political system that needed Harlem's votes, in the eyes of the business community that benefited from his protection, Bumpy Johnson was the law in Harlem. Not the police. Not the mayor. Not the Italian mob. Bumpy Johnson. And the Italian mob had to accept it. But acceptance was fragile. And there was a younger generation of Italian mobsters who didn't accept anything. Who saw Bumpy's success as a humiliation. Who believed that the old guard had gone soft. And they were about to test the wall that Bumpy had built. March 1956. The Genovese family is losing patience. Vito Genovese, running his empire from exile in Italy, is getting reports that make him furious. A black man controls a major territory. A black man makes decisions about who operates in Harlem. A black man has rewritten the rules that the Italian families wrote. Vito makes a decision. It's time to reassert dominance. Not by trying to take over Harlem, that failed years ago. But by breaking Bumpy publicly. Humiliating him in front of his own people. Showing everyone watching that the old hierarchy still holds. That black men ultimately answer to Italian men. He calls his brother Michael. Michael, running the New York operations, has been studying Bumpy for years. He knows Bumpy's moves. He knows that Bumpy works through relationships. That Bumpy is calculating and careful and almost impossible to trap. But Michael has an idea. What if they don't try to trap him? What if they just disrespect him, publicly, in his own territory, in front of his people? What if they show that they don't fear him? Bumpy rules through respect. What if they destroy that respect? Michael sends an enforcer. Vito Marcello. A man with a reputation earned through 15 years of pure violence. A man who's killed so many people that he stopped counting. A man who understands only one language: brutality. Vito Marcello's instructions are simple. Go to the Cotton Club. Grab Bumpy by the collar in front of everyone. Show that you don't fear him. Show that he's just another black gangster who can be disrespected by a real Italian mobster. And so Vito Marcello walks into the Cotton Club on March 15, 1956, at 10:23 p.m. He's about to learn something that will change his understanding of power forever. The Cotton Club is packed. Celebrities, politicians, businessmen, mobsters. The room is thick with cigarette smoke and the energy of people with power and money. Bumpy Johnson sits in his reserved corner booth. Gray suit. Diamond cuff links. Nursing a glass of Hennessy. He looks like he owns the place because he essentially does. The club managers know it. The customers know it. The staff knows it. Bumpy isn't just a customer, he's the reason the club is safe. The reason no robberies happen there. The reason the right people know they can conduct business without interruption. That's when Vito Marcello walks in. 6 feet 2 inches. 240 pounds. Built in Italian prisons. A face that's been rearranged by violence. Eyes that have seen things that make most men flinch. Vito walks straight toward Bumpy's table. The crowd parts. The music doesn't stop, but something shifts. The room's energy changes. People sense that something important is about to happen. Vito reaches Bumpy's table. Without a word, without preamble, Vito grabs Bumpy by the collar. His massive hand wraps around Bumpy's neck. The move is designed to be humiliating. A public assertion of dominance. A statement that says, "You don't matter. You're just another man I can grab like you're nothing." The room goes completely silent. What happens in the next 10 seconds will become legend. Because Bumpy Johnson doesn't panic. Doesn't fight back in the way that men fighting for their lives fight back. Instead, he leans back slightly. Looks up at Vito Marcello. And does something that seems almost impossible. He smiles. Not a scared smile. Not a submission. A smile that says, "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life, and you don't even know it yet." And then Bumpy whispers 6 words. The words are quiet. Only Vito hears them. But they must be powerful, because Vito's hand loosens. His grip relaxes. His entire body language shifts. And then Vito Marcello releases Bumpy's collar. He steps back. And walks out of the club without saying another word. The room stays silent for maybe 30 seconds. Then the music starts again. The conversations resume. The energy shifts back to normal. But everyone in that room knows something has changed. What Bumpy said to Vito Marcello remains a mystery. The 2 men who were closest to them have different versions. Some say Bumpy whispered a threat so specific that Vito realized he'd already lost. Some say Bumpy revealed information about Vito's family, his vulnerabilities, things that made the threat utterly real. The truth doesn't matter. What matters is that Vito Marcello walked out. He returned to Michael Genovese with a message that the mobster could hardly believe. He's not the kind of man you disrespect. I looked in his eyes and I understood. We made a mistake. Michael Genovese immediately reported this to the other families. Within 48 hours, the story spread through New York's underworld. Within 1 week, it reached Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia. By the end of the month, Every significant criminal organization in America knew that an Italian enforcer had grabbed Bumpy Johnson, and Bumpy Johnson had not only survived, he'd controlled the entire situation without throwing a punch. The Italian mob made an official decision. It came from the top. From Lucky Luciano's representatives in New York. Harlem belongs to Bumpy Johnson. We accept this. Further operations in Harlem will be ceased immediately. It was the first time in the history of organized crime that the Italian families formally acknowledged that they couldn't control a territory. The first time they admitted that a black man had rewired the rules. The invisible wall didn't just exist. It had become official. Here's what most people miss about Bumpy Johnson's rise to power. It wasn't built on violence. It was built on understanding. Understanding of human psychology. Understanding of how systems actually work beneath the surface. Understanding that real power isn't the ability to hurt people, it's the ability to make people choose you. Bumpy Johnson took a strategy that the Italian mob had perfected, control through organization, and applied it to something the mob never understood: community. The Italian mob ruled through fear. Bumpy ruled through necessity. When your neighborhood has no banks, Bumpy becomes your bank. When your family is being evicted, Bumpy becomes your salvation. When the police are harassing your business, Bumpy becomes your protection. When you have no other options, Bumpy becomes your choice. The Italian mob could send 100 soldiers into Harlem and kill Bumpy tomorrow. But the moment he was gone, the system they had controlled would collapse. Because the system wasn't held together by fear of Bumpy. It was held together by love for Bumpy. Respect for Bumpy. Need for Bumpy. That's the difference between ruling a territory and owning it. Bumpy owned Harlem in a way that the Italian mob had never owned anything. Not because he was stronger. Because he was smarter about what power actually is. Power is the ability to make people choose you when they have options. The Italian mob made people obey when they had no options. Completely different systems. What's remarkable about the wall that Bumpy Johnson built isn't that he built it. It's that it lasted. For over a decade, from 1956 to 1968 when Bumpy died, no Italian family tested Harlem seriously again. Not because they couldn't. Because they understood that trying would cost more than they could afford. Bumpy Johnson had proven something that changed organized crime forever: a man who understands his system can control territory that should be impossible for him to control. A black man in a city run by Italian families shouldn't have been able to do what Bumpy did. According to every rule that organized crime had written, he should have been eliminated or displaced years before he became powerful. But he rewrote the rules. The invisible wall wasn't built from bricks or violence. It was built from something stronger, from the understanding that real authority comes from being necessary to the people whose loyalty you need. When Bumpy died in his sleep in 1968, the system didn't crumble immediately. But over time, it weakened. Not because Bumpy wasn't replaced, he was replaced by capable men. But because Bumpy had understood something about leadership that most men never figure out. Leadership that's built on understanding people lasts. Leadership that's built on fear dies the moment the man with the fear dies. Bumpy Johnson's kingdom stood for a decade not because he was the most violent man in Harlem. It stood because he was the smartest. The most important thing about Bumpy Johnson isn't what he did. It's why he could do it. In a world where systems are designed to keep people powerless, Bumpy Johnson found the pressure points. He understood where the system was weak. He understood what people actually valued. He understood that money flowing through banks was less powerful than money flowing through communities. He took the rules that the Italian mob had written, rules about territory, authority, respect, profit, and he applied them in a way that the mob never expected. The mob applied their rules from the top down. They conquered territories and extracted value. Bumpy applied their rules from the bottom up. He protected territories and created value. Two different philosophies. The mob's philosophy broke the moment someone stronger came along. Bumpy's philosophy created something that outlasted him because it wasn't dependent on his physical strength or his willingness to use violence. It was dependent on his understanding of human nature. In the 1950s, organized crime was a closed system. Italian families ran everything. Black men were excluded from the inner circles, from the real money, from the real power. Bumpy Johnson broke that system. Not through revolution. Through something more subtle, by showing that the rules the families had written actually worked just as well when applied differently. The families didn't lose power because Bumpy defeated them militarily. They lost power in Harlem because Bumpy showed them that their own system had flaws. That loyalty, respect, and community control were more durable than fear. The most dangerous part of Bumpy's rise to power was how invisible it was. The police didn't understand what was happening. The newspapers didn't understand. Even the Italian mob took years to comprehend that they'd been outmaneuvered. They kept looking for the moment of violence. The battle. The coup. The dramatic confrontation where Bumpy would prove himself through brutality. It never came. Instead, there was a slow, steady accumulation of power. Of relationships. Of understood loyalties. Of a system that worked so well that trying to break it would cost more than it was worth. This is how real power operates in systems that are already established. You don't overthrow the system. You rewire it from within. You find the pressure points. You understand what people actually value. You provide that value in ways that the existing power structure can't replicate. The Italian mob could replicate violence. They could replicate fear. They could replicate the threat of force. They could never replicate Bumpy's relationship with Harlem. Because that relationship was built on something authentic. On the understanding that Bumpy was of Harlem. That he understood the community from the inside. That he cared about outcomes, not just profits. The mob cared about money. Bumpy cared about money too, but he understood that money was just a tool to control a territory and build a system. The goal wasn't profit. The goal was permanence. When historians look at Bumpy Johnson, they focus on the dramatic moments. The confrontations. The incidents that became legend. But the real story is subtler. The real story is about a man who understood that power is structural, not personal. That the durability of an empire depends on whether it's built on fear or necessity. The Roman Empire lasted for centuries because it made people feel that being part of Rome was beneficial. The British Empire ruled territories through the understanding that colonial infrastructure created dependency. Bumpy Johnson understood something similar. He created a system where Harlem benefited from his rule. Where people understood that their prosperity was tied to his authority. Where the alternative to his control wasn't freedom, it was chaos. The Italian mob offered, obey or die. Bumpy offered, cooperate and prosper. Different offers. Completely different systems. This is the invisible wall that Bumpy Johnson built. Not a wall you can see or touch. A wall built from relationships, from understood loyalties, from the knowledge that alternatives to the current system would be worse. By 1956, that wall had become so solid that the most powerful criminal organization in America had to respect it. Not because they wanted to. Because they had to. And that's the deepest lesson of Bumpy Johnson's rise to power. The most impenetrable walls aren't built from stone or steel. They're built from the understanding that breaking them costs more than respecting them.